Mike, thanks for joining me today. How are you and your family doing at this time?
Pete, we're hanging in there. How about you guys? Hope you're doing well too.
Yeah, we're well. With my girlfriend in Queens. My family is out in Long Island, so went to see them the other day. Everyone's doing well. Just trying to, Jack. I spoke to Jack already last week. He said he was a rule follower. We're trying to do the same thing. Social distance when I go out for walks, and I just went to the grocery store today. Try to keep away from people as best you can, and wear your mask and do what you have to do. But hopefully this ends soon. But for now, we're just keep taking it day by day and see what happens.
All you can do.
So I hate to start off on a kind of somber note, but I think it's important. Anthony Causi unfortunately passed away from this disease in April. Anthony was a really renowned sports photographer. I wish I had the chance to work with him. I never did, unfortunately, in my time as a sports writer at Newsday. But from hearing stories and seeing your column on him, it seemed like he was a really, really respected person in the business. I know some of my fellow photographers I work with at Newsday were really, taken back by it and obviously really upset by it. For people who didn't know Anthony, and you knew him really well, obviously working at the Post with him, what kind of person was he, and why are so many people, making posts about him and showing their support for him? What kind of guy was him that people might not know if they don't know him? What kind of person was Anthony?
Yeah, Pete, the best way that I've described him, I think, is that his personality was both larger than life and yet incredibly humble. And that's kind of a hard daily double to pull off. But he really was. He was extraordinarily talented. He knew it, but he also knew that the way to stay that way was to work harder than the next guy. He was incredibly competitive, and yet in a competitive business like this, you'll have a hard time finding anybody to say a bad word about him. And not just now since he's passed, but even when he was in the absolute prime of his career, his job every day was to try and get a better picture than you did. And most of the time, you acknowledge the next morning that he did. And to work with him was extraordinary because writers and photographers kind of look at things in different ways. I mean, as writers, we react to what we see. As photographers, you almost have to anticipate the way an athlete does in order to be in the right position, the right place. And Anthony always was. And the two of us, when we worked together, those two kind of opposite elements really, I think, kind of worked very well when we were on a similar assignment. And it certainly worked well in terms of talking about our different crafts. We could speak for hours about that. Him about photography, me about writing, and it was really hours would melt away listening to him talk about just the great passion he had for this job of his, which was also a pastime, which is also a calling, which is also a vocation. And you can really see that, and that kind of really manifested itself a lot of times. I mean, there's literally thousands and thousands of scrapbooks and framed pictures all across New York of pictures, perfect strangers. Anthony just met at baseball stadiums or at Madison Square Garden, and they would just take their picture. If they saw that one of their kids was probably their first trip to the Garden, he would make sure he took their picture, and he would take 100 of them until they got the right one. Then send them the print for free and absolutely refuse payment for these things. And this wasn't just something he did once or twice. I mean, he did it. I mean, I dare say he did it every day of his professional life. It was impossible to get him out of a ballpark if he wanted to have dinner afterward, because he was always mingling with strangers. Meanwhile, the rest of us have our heads down looking to get the hell out of Dodge. And, Anthony's making new friends every day. That's really what it was like. And, to be around his talent was extraordinary. To be around his personality was the same. And it was just, it was just an extraordinary time to work together, because his talent was it's forever. I mean, you see some of the pictures that he took, they will last forever. They'll outlast, so much of the work that we do. And in fact, the one thing that I do remember last year when Eli Manning played his last game at MetLife Stadium, we're up in the press box, we're all fighting with each other, trying to figure out 700 perfect words to kind of memorialize what we just saw. And yet there Anthony was, and he took the picture of the day, which was Eli with his daughters afterward. And that's the only thing people are going to remember from that day. And I think that tells you a little bit about him also.
It seemed like he was so well respected by not only people in the industry, but also athletes themselves. I think recently I saw that Robinson Cano and the New York Mets were donating to his GoFundMe page. What does it have to say that a photographers might not be known by a lot of people by name, but for him, he seemed to be so well known by the athletes. What does that have to say about his personality and what he did on a day in and day out basis?
It says everything about it. It says everything about why he was able to be as good as he was in some ways, because he would ask these athletes to do crazy things, pose in weird spots, and do certain things for pictures. And these are guys who are used to saying no to everybody, and they are used to having a pretty universal mistrust of everybody. And these guys would do whatever Anthony asked them to do, and that's because they trusted him, because they knew him, because they knew that he wasn't going to put them in bad positions or make them look foolish or embarrassed. And he never did, and he always came away with incredible pictures and incredible spots. And a lot of times I tell you about him sending these pictures off to strangers at ballparks, but he would do the same thing for these athletes. I mean, I guarantee you Mariano Rivera has a framed picture of Anthony's famous shot of him jogging into a game somewhere prominently in his house. Most of these guys did because they respected his talent, and because they did, they were willing to do things for him they wouldn't do for anybody else.
I'll just switch gears a little bit. It's kind of sticking on the coronavirus a little bit. There's been no sports going on. The Korean Baseball League started up a couple of days ago. I was watching that at 1 a.m. for a couple of minutes, and I said, I can't do this anymore. But being that this time is so crazy and there's no sports really going on, how hard has it been for you to try and find stories, interesting stories that people want to read?
Well, I don't know if hard's the right word, Pete, because to me, it's really what you're forced to do is go back to your roots of why you got in the business in the first place, which, for most of us, was to be able to find and tell interesting stories. Now, when you're a sports columnist in New York City, you have a lot of opportunities to latch on to games, scheduled events that, kind of make, your scheduling easier, in the sense that that on Tuesday I'm going to be here at the Bronx, and Friday I'll be in Queens, and maybe on Sunday I'll be at a hockey game or a basketball game. But obviously we don't have that crutch to lean on to anymore. But I think, look, maybe I have an advantage because I've been doing this so long, but there are a million stories in the everyday. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is a great story, but it means that they're out there somewhere. If you're willing to, put in the time and make the phone calls and, scour through archives and use your imagination. That's one of the great things about this opportunity. I would rather not have to do it. I try to do this kind of stuff anyway, even in between the games when there are games. And a lot of times these are the kind of columns that are the most fun to write. But, now it's really just a matter of using your imagination, using your creativity, and figuring it out. When you think about it in basic terms, to be able to get 800 interesting words about somebody, something event that happened, something that's going to happen, it's really not all that intimidating when you compare it to some of the things that people are having to do in these days. So it's really kind of a fun opportunity to be able to, look, I understand we're no way minimizing the stories at the front of the paper. And certainly I've written my share of coronavirus stories and columns since this all began. But I do think that in sports anyway, and probably in other parts of the paper too, what we're allowed to do is offer people 5 minutes, 6 minutes, whatever they take to read through our stuff. And that gives them 5 or 6 minutes a day where they're not worrying about the world falling in on them. They're not worrying about thinking about their jobs. They're not thinking about the virus. They're not thinking about having to walk outside with a mask on and gloves on. And I think if we can do that, that means we're actually doing our part. And so it's actually not only fun and interesting, as the job always is, but it's also kind of gratifying and kind of satisfying.
You awarded the New York Sportswriter of the Year award for 2019 by the National Sports Media Association. The third time you've won the award, became the sixth person to do it, like I mentioned before. When you found out the news, what was your reaction knowing that you won it again after winning in 2013 and 2014?
Well, I thought that maybe the day I won it was the same day as the national championship game between LSU and Clemson. So I thought maybe my boss might tell me I could take an edition off and I have to write an early column. But he was happy for the award, but he wasn't going to do that. So I had to write an early column that day anyway. So I think that's that's a story that's a little based in old-timey sports writing and daily journalism, which is, you can't ever rest on anything. There's a great story about when Arthur Daly of the New York Times became the first sports writer to win a Pulitzer back in the 50s. and his friend Red Smith, who really wanted to win a Pulitzer and would later on in his life, but he reached out to him and said, "Congratulations! Now you only have to write one a day." And that's kind of the way the awards are. Look, I mean, as journalists, we're a very self-congratulatory lot. We like to offer each other compliments and plaques and trophies, and that's wonderful. And I've never turned one down, and I've never handed one back. But I think what it is a reminder that the reason why you won the award is because you did the job a certain way. And so it's a reminder that that's the way you have to do it throughout the course of the year. So I had to write that early that day, and I had to write three different columns for the 3 different editions that day. And I was at home. There's no place I'd rather be. And you know what I wouldn't give to be able to have the same kind of day scheduled Friday and do 3 different games, 3 different columns of a baseball game. That'd be a nice return to normalcy for me.
Now, the award ceremony I read somewhere is supposed to be in June. Was that postponed, or is that still on schedule?
No, it was. It was supposed to be in Winston-Salem in June, and we were playing a nice little weekend getaway to Winston-Salem. No finer place to be in June. But it was postponed. I've been to that banquet before, and what's great about it is it's the association who gives out the award it used to be called the National Sportswriter and Sportscast Association. It's now just called the National Media Foundation, and they have this weekend every year where they honor, state winners and national winners and Hall of Famers. And it's the way I've described it to people. It's the one time and the only time anywhere in the world where for 3 days you'll be treated like the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. For 3 days, sports writers and sportscasters are treated like kings and princes and queens and princesses. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen this year. But they also do give a really cool plaque. So a really cool trophy. So I'm actually looking forward to getting mine. I already have the other 2, and I'll find a place for this one too.
This might be a tough question. Might be almost impossible to answer. Out of all the columns you've written throughout the years, is there 1 or 2 that you come off at the top of your head that you wrote and at the time said, wow, I really like this, and 2, after the fact that you posted it and it was online in the paper when people read it, the reaction that you got was incredible? Can you pick 1 or 2 from your years at the Post?
Well, the proper answer is to say the one that I'm writing for tomorrow, right? You touched on Anthony Causi. I wrote a column the day after he passed away, and that really I've never seen my column generate that many replies. Obviously, that was just me putting into words what Anthony meant to a lot of people. Right. So it almost doesn't count, but it was still very rewarding to see that people actually read it, embraced it, and moved by it. One of the things that I miss now are the big events, and I think that one of the things that I have that allows me to do this job at a certain level is that I have the ability to write fast, write on deadline, capture moments. I mean, that's just something that, part of it is something that you're gifted with, I think, at birth, but some of it is hard work. Dave Anderson was a great columnist of the New York Times for many years, and when I first started doing this, he gave me a wonderful piece of advice, and he said, do it every day, try and be faster than anybody who's better than you and better than anybody that's faster than you. And that's kind of a credo to live by, but that means that, at these big events, that really helps. The Olympics are I've done 6 Olympics. Wow. I wasn't going to do the one in Tokyo this year. My Olympic days are probably behind me, but the Olympics were always a fun challenge because you were there for 20 days, 25 days, and you were writing 60 to 65 columns, and you were seeing the most extraordinary stories by the most extraordinary athletes, and so they almost by rote would produce themselves. I once saw a badminton match between Malaysia and South Korea, which I still remember to this day. Wow. As the most fascinating event I ever covered, because Malaysia had never beaten South Korea. It went to a 3rd set, and Korea prevailed, and it was 2,000 Malaysians on one side of the court and 2,000 Koreans on the other side, and it was the most spectacular event I've ever seen live. Both giant Super Bowl wins that I've been able to write about, being able to be there in the moment and try and capture a slice of what it was like to be there that day. That was very exciting. Same thing with the 2009 Yankees. Believe it or not, my favorite team that won a championship that I was there for every day was the 2000 Devils. I grew up a big hockey fan. I was a big Islanders fan as a kid. I haven't covered a lot of hockey. It's a hard sport to cover. My hat's off to Brian Burke, to Brandon Burke and the kid, the people who try and broadcast these things, because I just can't imagine being a hockey broadcaster. Being a hockey writer is hard enough. But those 2000 Devils had 20 guys in the locker room there were 20 different columns and 20 different characters. And it was a good thing because I had to write them every day for about 60 days because they won the Stanley Cup that year. But so, somewhere in that lies an answer. I was also there for all three of the incredible games of the 2001 World Series. And, being there for game 4 when Tino ties it with 2 outs in the ninth, for game 5 when Brocious ties it with 2 outs in the ninth, when I had actually left the press box because I figured they couldn't do it 2 nights in a row, so I had to scramble back up. And then, of course, for game 7 where, me and about 200 other sports writers on Deadline have, one of our best columns ever was the Yankees winning 4 in a row that nobody ever read because it never ran anywhere because the Diamondbacks ruined all of our plans. So, but to be able to write off that game, especially given the significance of the time and place of when that all happened, these are all things that, that go. I'm sure I'm missing a couple because that's one of the, one of the pleasures of this job is that you write 200 columns a year. So if you write a bad one today, you have a chance to write a good one, on Friday. And if you write a good one today, no one's going to remember it by the time, it's wrapping fish on Saturday. So it's a very humbling job, but it's a very fun one. And, I can't imagine one that's more packed with adrenaline.
You mentioned you covered the Olympics. Did you have a chance to cover Phelps at all and speak to him? If so, how was that? And he's one of obviously the most decorated athletes of all time with all his gold medals. But did you have a chance to talk to him? And like I said, how was that?
Well, it's the Olympics, so there's no such thing as a one-on-one there. Although it is actually a little more intimate than what we have in America because we have what you call the mix zone there. So you kind of grab these guys as they're leaving their events. But I was there for all of his wins in 2000 in Sydney,
Wow.
all of his wins in 2004 in Athens, and of course in Beijing in 2008 is when he really made his mark. And that was amazing because it was the other side of the world. So you were basically waking up on Deadline, and they would have these the daily swim meet about 8 o'clock in the morning, Beijing time, which was just in time to hit the papers back home because it was prime time back home. So that was very interesting, and that ruined my body clock for about 6 months afterward. But and look, I'm certainly no swim expert, although we certainly act like it. We behave that way during the 16 days of the Olympics. We're all biathlon experts when we're writing about it. But Phelps was a great subject only because, when you're a sports writer, one of the things you want to be able to be around is excellence.
Right.
I know we get accused of only liking to write about negative things, and sometimes sometimes bad things happen, so you have to rip the Mets or you have to make fun of the Knicks or whatever. But we get into it because we want to see good stuff. We want to see great stuff, and we want to see great athletes at the top of their games. And which is why it's great to watch Tom Brady, at his peak. It's why it's great to watch. I was able to watch, Michael Jordan when he was great, and then years later LeBron James to watch him in his prime. And that's why it was great to watch Michael Phelps, especially in Beijing where he was, he literally everything he touched turned to gold.
Mm-hmm.
He won matches he won races in blowouts, and he won races by a 100th of a second. And it was something different every day, something new every day, and you knew you were around the guy who did what he did better than anybody in the world. And there's something really, really fun about doing that.
I was looking at a couple of your most recent columns, and one of them that really stuck out to me was the Lou Alcindor column, obviously known as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar now, but his choice to go to UCLA instead of staying home from New York. He went to high school in New York and then chose to go to UCLA instead of playing for St. John's. And he talked about how that kind of changed things a bit. You think if he decided to go to St. John's instead of going to UCLA, how would that have changed things?
Well, I think St. John's would have only won about 3 national championships. And, when you win 3, then maybe you win, 6 more like UCLA did. I mean that. Because St. John's had not just that you'd have the best player in the world, and maybe, and without question to me, the best college player of all time on your team for 3 varsity seasons. But St. John's had pretty good teams those years. Those are Lou Carter-Secca's first 3 years. They all went to postseason. The 68 team went to the NCAAs, the 68-69 team. They played Alcindor and UCLA at the Garden, one of the first college sellouts at the new Garden, and they played them really tough for about 25 minutes. UCLA pulled away because they did that to everybody. But if you give Alcindor to St. John's, I have a feeling they probably win that game. They win a lot more. And you're certainly probably looking at 3 banners in the hall, in Alumni Hall in the Garden. You're probably talking about, who knows how many more victories for Lou Carnesecca, who spent some time with the Nets after those teams are so good that he had at St. John's. He actually got a pro job out of it, although he wound up going back to St. John's after 3 years. So would have changed a lot of things. It's certainly a great what if, but that's one of the look. You asked earlier about getting work done during this pandemic, and that's one of the things that I do as a matter of routine now is every couple of days, I'll spin through old. I have access to old digital archives for a lot of newspapers and go back and see what would happen on this day in 1970, what happened on this day 55 years ago, what happened on this day 60 years ago, and I've gotten a couple of columns that way. Some were obvious dates. We're going to celebrate the way that Newsday has. We're going to celebrate the Knicks' 50th anniversary on Friday, and there are other anniversaries coming up that are obvious. But the ones that I like coming up with are, literally, I woke up on Sunday, kind of started looking through stuff, and all of a sudden, boom, I saw that story, and it just so happened that it was, a quasi-anniversary day 55 years ago. So that's how that stuff happens, and I happen to have an affinity for history, so it's even if I hadn't come up with anything to write about, I would have been interested to look at old newspapers. So it's nice to be able to use your hobby when it has a payoff for your job.
You've written so many columns throughout the years, and I kind of think I know the answer to this question, but I think it's going to be kind of funny to ask. Have you ever written a column about a person or an athlete that might be perceived as negative, and the person's actually wrote to you or called you or texted you saying, hey, what's this about? And then did you have a conversation with him or her regarding the column?
I guess one of the things I'm proud of is that I think that generally speaking, especially if I'm going to rip somebody, it's usually not terribly ambiguous. So I don't do it with a lot of soft shoes. But I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question exactly as you asked it. But I will say that one of the things that I was taught early on as a pup, as a young pup columnist, is that when you look, a column is a bully pulpit. So you're obviously going to criticize people. You're going to rip people. You're going to murder people sometimes with your words, and you're going to fire them. You're going to trade them. You're going to end their careers or suggest their careers be over. And these are hard things to do. And the harder thing and the right thing is to make sure that you make yourself visible to them after you write it. That means sometimes, instead of taking days off, going to places just so you're not looking for a fight, but you want to be in their line of vision. I can recall one time when Isaiah Thomas was doing what he was doing with the Knicks, and I can't remember if it was when he was coaching or GMing, but he had done something awful. And I wake up on a Sunday morning, and in the back page of the Post is my column with a picture of Isaiah Thomas photoshopped onto a clown. So that was a little interesting to have to answer for. And I was supposed to have the next day off, and I realized that I was going to have to go to Knicks practice and, like I said, just be there for Isaiah. If he could see me, and if he wanted to talk to me, then he would, And I think that allows you to get away with things. Look, I like to think that I don't take a lot of cheap shots. Mm-hmm. Probably in my youth I did. There were some things I wrote about guys I was criticizing that, I wouldn't write about that now, given you a little older, a little wiser. And I think as long as you criticize without taking cheap shots, they appreciate that. And look, I've never had a relationship end on me because of something I've written. I've had uncomfortable confrontations. And, even now, there are guys, I've written a lot of hard columns about Jeff Wilpon. I've written a lot of hard columns about, guys like that. And look, we have a relationship because they know that while I'm going to criticize them, Sandy Olson, I wrote a bunch of scathing columns about him, but even at the end of the day, he understood that was part of the profession, and part of being professional is knowing you're going to get criticized and having skin thick enough to let it deflect off you.
Besides being a columnist, I believe you written 3 books. Is that correct?
Right.
What goes into that? How time consuming is it? And of the 3 books you've written, is there a particular favorite of the 3?
Well, what's great about doing books when you're also writing a column, and now I've never taken a sabbatical to write a book. I've never been in a place that would allow it, or, wanted me to just give me 3 months off to do it. And I actually appreciate that, because it actually, I think it's interesting. It sounds like it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. Look, I mean, a book is 80,000 words, 90,000 words. It's a lot of words. And you try and, if you start thinking about the awesome task, which is that this book is going to be preserved forever in the Library of Congress and so on and so forth, you'll never write a word. But I mean, you do want to get it right. But one of the things about the 3 time periods when I've written the book is that I really believe that not only does the column allow the book to be written better, but the book allows the column to be written better, because they're two different disciplines. You're writing a column, and these and whatever you're writing comes out in these 700 word spasms, and then you move on. When you're writing a book, I mean, sometimes if you want to, if you're writing 2,000, 3,000 words a day, so basically you're writing a takeout feature for every day.
Right.
You're writing about the book, and so those are different elements. Those are different. It's different, language arts that you're using to get your points across, and I think that they complement each other. And at least I always found it that way. I'm lucky because I'm not one who's often sidelined by writer's block, which is obviously a real impediment if you're trying to write a column and certainly if you're trying to write a book. But I've written 3 books. I mean, it's interesting. The 2 more recent ones are the ones that I found myself actually going back and reading them again, because I just like the stories. One was about the 1912 World Series between the Giants and the Red Sox, which was probably the best World Series that was ever played. It was the first great World Series for sure. Incredible amount of characters, an incredibly rich time. There were a couple of great concurrent stories that I included in the book. One of which was a trial of the century. One of which was the presidential election, which included Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft and Woodrow Wilson. So that was a lot of fun. The one prior to that was a book I had written about 1941, which I dubbed the greatest year in sports, which included a lot of incredible milestone events in sports that year. But what made them more compelling was the backdrop of the gathering storm of war. And obviously there was already war raging in Europe, and we would be joining the fray by December 7th. And to be able to kind of juxtapose sports and the most awful kind of real world stories, that was a lot of fun. So those are my 2 favorite books. I also read a book about the Red Sox-Yankees rivalry, which was my first book, which I'm also very proud of, but that was more of a straightforward baseball book. The other 2 kind of I was able to touch on other elements of life, not just the sports part of it.
You got your degree from St. Bonaventure in communications, right? In mass communications?
That's right. St. Bonaventure, I'm a proud Bonnie. Anybody who knows me is tired of hearing about the Bonnies, I can promise you.
Before college, I'm assuming, when was the first time you really said, hey, I could be a sports writer? And was there a time where you thought maybe, there might be another career for you? And what was that, if that was the case?
Well, I can honestly look. I realize how unusual this is, and it's going to sound fake, but I swear it's true. I've literally known exactly what I wanted to do since I was 7 years old. And when I say exactly what I wanted to do, I mean I wanted to be the sports columnist of the New York Post from the time I was 7 years old. Now that's hatched by my father bringing me on my first baseball game at Shea Stadium in 1974. And I've got this sensory overload of everything at the ballpark that a 7-year-old kid sees. And then my father points to the press box and he says, well, that's where the sports writers work. And I said, well, what do they do? And he explained what sports writers do. And I was like, so you can make a living writing about baseball games? And he said, yes. And it was from that time on that I started. He worked in the city, and he would bring home the New York Post, which is an afternoon newspaper at that time. And when he brought it home, I would read it cover to cover, certainly the sports page, and devour it every day when I was a kid. I love telling Steve Serby about that story, and he doesn't like the part where I was 7 years old reading him. But so that's really where it hatched. And I mean, that's all I've ever wanted to do. I've never wavered from that. I know that's not usual. It's not the way that a lot of things go. I was fortunate because I went to school at Chaminade and worked for the school paper there and wrote sports for Tarmac there, which was the student newspaper, and that really allowed me an early opportunity to realize that I could, at least figure out a way to get my stories into print. I realized that, there's a real high that goes along with seeing your byline, whether it's in Tarmac or whether it's in the New York Post. And from there it was just kind of figuring out how to get to where I wanted to get to. And now I'm not going to fool anybody and say that it was easy path to get to the job that I ultimately wanted, nor will I tell you that I would have considered it a failure if I hadn't actually got the exact job I wanted when I was 7 years old. But it just worked out that way, and it's kind of a fun story, I think, and it shows you that. Look, I mean, what I tell a lot of college kids whenever I talk to them is that don't think that you're going to get your ultimate ideal dream job, because most of you aren't. But look at me and know that you might, and it's a possibility, and there's no reason to believe that it's impossible, because it's clearly possible, because I'm here to tell you it is.
Two more questions, and I'll let you go. The first one is, with the times changing as far as from when you started until now, social media has become huge in the industry. Things have changed over time. How have you been able to adapt in the 21st century with the social media and all the different type of advancements that have been made with technology and things like that? How does it apply to your field?
Well, it's you take the good with the bad, and I mean that in every way possible. I mean, are there times that I wish that we lived in the olden days when the newspaper columnist had the most powerful voice in town? Not just the most powerful voice, but the only voice in town. I mean, Dick Young was ruled the roost in the city for 30 years, because there weren't any other options. But that said, you had to actually, there was only one way you could read Dick Young. That's if you bought the Daily News. I mean, I don't necessarily have the same unlittered feel that he had, but there's a lot of different ways now that you can read my columns every day if you want to, whether it's social media, however, the internet. I mean, it's literally available to 1 billion people every day. So there's that upside to it. And look, I know a lot of folks of my age, and I'm 53, around my generation, have always been a little turned off by the notion of bloggers or podcasters, or even before that, going back a couple of years. I mean, when radio and TV folks first started showing up in the clubhouse. But to me, it only makes I not only welcome them, but I'm glad that they do the jobs they do, because they've all forced me to be on top of my game. I mean, I know too many columnists who, as they've advanced in years, decide that they no longer have to talk to anybody. They can do all their columns from home, and of course that's what we're doing now. But we're talking about in real time, regular times, and they don't work at it anymore. But one of the things that's great about working in these times is that when bloggers first came along, I thought it was great, because I mean, here are people who are writing like 5,000 words about Bruce Springsteen or about the Mets or about the Jets, and they're not getting paid for it. I mean, they don't know anybody's going to read it. They're doing it because it's their passion. And when those people get followings, I mean, it's legit. And it's something that I think forces guys like me to remember that one of the advantages we have is that we have a press pass around our neck. We have access to these players. We have access to the games. And that's what allows us a little bit, something different than what someone who's a fan writing eloquently on their blog doesn't have. And I'm not saying that that voice isn't welcome. I'm saying that that voice being there forces me to actually do my job better than I did before, or at least as well, and not fall into bad habits. So to me, I'm grateful for the way that the world has evolved. Made it harder. Look, I mean, the media business is a tough business. Yeah. There aren't as many jobs, not as many opportunities, not at least in the traditional sense as there used to be. But there is still ways to do that, and there's still ways to make your way. And like I said, it forces you to really kind of be on top of your game, even on days when you don't feel like being on top of your game.
And the final thing is kind of a hypothetical, but I think it's important in the times that we're in right now to discuss it. We don't know when sports are going to come back, the major sports, NBA, if they're going to resume their season, MLB, NHL. We probably know that when it does come back, there's going to be no fans in the stands for a while. But when fans do come back, how do you vision what it's going to look like? Do you think there'll be every third seat will be filled, every fifth seat to be filled? Like I said, it's kind of a hypothetical, but from what you've seen in the last, couple months here, how do you think it's going to be when the fans are finally able to return to arenas and stadiums?
I know I've seen people talk about that before. I actually think that I do think the games will come back without fans. I don't think that any fans are going to come back until there's a vaccine or there's I don't know if the right word is cure, but if there's a way to at least assure folks that it's not going to be dangerous to be around people in crowded in venues. Because I get it. I mean, I know the Dolphins have discussed a plan where instead of allowing 60,000 people in their stadium, it's going to be 15,000 people and no concession lines. But you know what? The first few games where that happens, if it happens that way, you're still going to look at people who are 10 seats away and wonder, well, did you just breathe kind of in my general? I mean, you can't live that way. I just don't think that's feasible. So I think it's actually going to be a thing where it's going to be an extended period of time where there's no fans. And then when fans are allowed in, it's basically going to be you're allowed back in like old times. I still think it's going to be sparsely attended at first because people will come back slowly. But I just don't think that people are going to be willing to take a chance that we know with any kind of assurance that sitting six seats away or 20 seats away or 50 seats away is going to be enough. We just don't know enough. And I don't think we'll be comfortable going back in mass numbers until we do know.
Is that something you'll be, I mean, I'm sure the Post will be following closely, but is that something you'll be kind of focusing on as far as when things come back, how they're coming back, when are fans coming back? Is that something you're going to be looking at all?
I'm sure we will. I mean, look, I mean, it's because that's when, look, I mean, the thing that's, people forget about sports is even in normal times, it's not just the games that we cover, but if somebody gets thrown out of the game for steroids, we're going to write about that. That's not necessarily a fun story to write about. And in some ways, the whole idea of sports returning to normalcy, none of it's going to be fun because none of it's going to be anything that we're used to or anything that we really want. I mean, we want the games to return. I mean, give us all the truths here, and we're going to say, give us the games tomorrow, give us a reason to believe that we can go to these games and not get sick, and we'll go. I mean, everybody who's a sports fan will make the same deal. It's just not realistic. So you kind of have to deal with things. And look, I mean, whenever anybody, even has the gumption to say, well, gosh, we might not have sports the rest of the year, people jump on them because they don't want to be told, they don't want their optimism crushed. And I get that, I mean, I don't either. To me, it's depressing to think about the fact that the next game that we see might not be till 2021. I don't want to believe that. And so I don't want to hear that. But, part of the things that we do as journalists, as you know, Pete, is that sometimes we tell stories that people don't necessarily want to read, but they're supposed to and they need to.
Right. Well, Mike, it was a pleasure. Congratulations once again on winning the Sportswriter of the Year award for 2019. Pleasure talking to you, getting a chance to know you for these last, I think you gave me 40 minutes, which is fantastic. Thank you so much. Please continue to stay safe, and I look forward to reading your stuff as we move forward here.
Well, you gave me a chance to talk about my favorite subject, and I mean journalism, not me. So thanks, Pete.
You're welcome, Mike. Thanks. Take care.
Take care.